Two young boys are wandering near 12 Mile Creek waterway in Ontario, Canada during a fishing trip. They do not have a specific destination in mind and are content exploring the area in search of whatever might come their way. But what comes their way would not make them content. They come across a blue vinyl bag near the surface of the muddy water. They drag it to the shore and open it up. Inside, they see a green garbage bag. When they rip it open, it's not at all what they expect. They run away, screaming. Inside the bag is the body of a 5-year-old girl along with a 10-pound anchor. She has a small bandage on her knee and bruises on her temples. It would not be long before authorities discovered exactly who the young girl was. On the same day, her grandfather, Doug Pollington, would report that his 29-year-old daughter, along with her own young son and daughter, were missing. The girl found in the water was that young daughter, Stephanie Rallo. The discovery and her death is brutal and tragic, no matter how you look at it. But the person who did this to her and all the circumstances surrounding the crime were enough to disgust even the criminal's most hardened resulting fellow inmates. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we'll be talking about one of the early but arguably one of the most disturbing family annihilators, John Rallo. And not that this annihilator's murders themselves were not tragic and appalling enough, but his level of despicableness and lack of remorse across the board is highly disturbing. Let's dive in. And before we get started, if you end up liking how we present this case and can spare a quick moment, we really appreciate it if you could hit like, subscribe, and share pretty please. Let's go. John George Rallo was born in the Canadian port city of Hamilton, Ontario, on November 30th, 1942. He was the only child to parents Jack and Dorothea Rallo. Jack was a forensic identification officer responsible for photographing crime scenes until John was a teenager, at which time he took a job at the Liquor Control Board as a manager. Growing up, John was not a particularly handsome teen, with pretty disheveled hair and reportedly lanky limbs. But he was charming and confident, and he had style. He set himself apart from others by always dressing for success. So while his peers were rocking jeans and other casual clothes, John could always be found decked out in his finest, as though he were headed to a job interview or going on a date. From a young age, John had an obsession with girls. He would often stand on downtown street corners just to watch girls passing by. He dropped out of school in 12th grade and finished high school through correspondence, then attended Mohawk Community College. He dated a lot and fancied himself a ladies' man. That was until he met Sandra Pollington. When John was 20 years old, he met 15-year-old Sandra Pollington. Born in 1947 to Margaret and Doug Pollington, Sandra grew up with her younger brother and sister in Hamilton as well. John and Sandra began dating, but Sandra's family did not care for John, both because they felt he was too old for Sandra and because he was Catholic. But with Sandra being head over heels for John, they accepted the relationship. John worked in the engineering department at Hamilton City Hall and eventually worked his way up to becoming an office manager. Sandra worked as a title searcher at a law firm. The couple dated for 4 years, then got married on October 8, 1966. A few years later, in 1969, the couple welcomed their first son, John Jason. Then 2 years later, in 1971, they welcomed a daughter, Stephanie. The family appeared happy, but everyone knows that looks can be deceiving. John had a wandering eye that went beyond just looking. He was involved in multiple extramarital affairs with women, including a long-term affair with someone he worked with. At one point in their marriage, John consulted with a divorce attorney, and Sandra stopped wearing her wedding ring, sharing with her close friends that John was not satisfying her sexually. The couple even briefly listed their house for sale. And then, Sandra and her babies were missing. The discovery that Sandra and the kids were missing came when John showed up at his father-in-law, Doug Pollington's office in Cambridge with a typewritten letter from Sandra. It had been a full day and a half that they had gone missing by that point. The letter claimed that Sandra was leaving John for a wealthy lawyer and was taking the kids with her. That did not ring true to Doug, who felt that he and his wife were close to Sandra and that she gave no indications she would be leaving. John also told Doug that a mysterious lawyer had been making harassing calls to his house for over a year. John strangely urged his father-in-law to contact an attorney before going to the police. Doug obliged. John and his in-laws then went to the Rallo home where John continued crying over his missing family. Cries that his mother-in-law recalled did not produce a single tear. In fact, she said that she never saw any tears during the entire ordeal. She said that overall he never showed any emotion or seemed to be bothered that his family, including his young children, were missing. John and his mother-in-law Margaret head to John's parents' house to break the news. Once there, the two mothers try to convince John to go to the hospital to get treatment for his hand, but he refuses. Sandra's younger sister Janice also comes over. She had been avoiding John and his increasing flirtatiousness all summer. When she would babysit her niece and nephew, John would often arrive home unexpectedly, so much so that Janice had taken to locking herself in the bathroom and running the shower to get away from him. When Janice went to leave on this day, John walked her to her car. Janice said that he wrapped his arms around her, then put his hands down her pants. And that wasn't the first time he had assaulted her. About a year and a half before the disappearance, Janice reported to police that John had groped her, and she pressed charges against him. During that investigation, law enforcement discovered that John was in possession of graphic and violent bondage pornographic magazines. The content contained in them was so hardcore that they were actually illegal in Canada. Specific details found in those magazines would surprisingly later match up to key evidence relevant to John's family's disappearance. Meanwhile, Doug Pollington had been advised by the attorney that he had contacted to contact the police. Once he did, the investigation was on. The following morning, John arrives to work by 9 a.m. An hour later, a detective arrives in his office and announces he's there to do a missing person report. John tells him, "I was just going to call you." As the detective begins talking with Rallo and taking notes, he hears a radio report. A young girl has been found in a creek, stuffed in a duffel bag. It was the Rallo's daughter, Stephanie. The two young boys have found her during their exploration. She was stuffed inside a trash bag, then forced into the duffel, along with an anchor intended to send her to the bottom of the waterway. Police asked Rallo to come down to the station for an interview. When he later told Rallo that the body of the little girl that was found was confirmed to be his daughter, he hung his head. But there were, again, no tears. When police arrives at the Rallo home, it's in a shambles. The couple's mattress is in the hallway, with John's reasoning being that he took the bed apart to relieve his frustration after his family went missing, and that he couldn't bear to sleep in the bed that he used to share with his wife after learning that she had been cheating on him, according to him. John also explained that the night their daughter Stephanie was born, Sandra had hemorrhaged, explaining away any blood they would find on the mattress. He also said later that Sandra cut blood stains out of their mattress cover. They questioned John, and his account of the events went like this. He said that he and Sandra had not shared a bed the past few nights. He said they had had a fight over his relationship with a neighbor. He described that the neighbor came over to borrow some liquor, and as I handed it to her, I touched her on the breast. He said that the neighbor told the whole neighborhood, and that Sandra was humiliated. The two families reconciled and became friends again, but on the Friday before the disappearance, while the two couples were skinny dipping in the pool until the wee hours of the morning, John and the grazed breast neighbor lingered just a little too long alone in the pool for Sandra's liking. John insisted it was just horseplay, but Sandra was livid. So John was sleeping in the basement on a cot. He said he woke up around 9 a.m. on the morning of August 17th and found it odd that the kids were not yet awake. He went upstairs and found that both kids were not in their beds, and neither was Sandra. He said he found the typed note from Sandra on the dresser, claiming she had left him for a wealthy lawyer. She left without her purse, wedding ring, or even the kids' shoes, toothbrushes, or toys. The only thing she did take was her wallet. John recounted how they had been receiving anonymous phone calls for about a year from a male caller who let it slip one day that he was a lawyer. John said he handled it not by reporting it to the police, but by challenging the caller to meet him in person, telling him, "Let's be grown up and let's meet." He said the caller never showed up to their meeting place. John insisted that it must be the mysterious lawyer who was responsible for his family's disappearance, not him. Despite the fact that there was not a single shred of evidence to prove the existence of this mystery lawyer, John was sticking to his story. Then John, by his own account, engaged in several questionable actions, which he presented to authorities as though they were reasonable and not suspicious at all. On the morning of Tuesday, August 17th, the first full day of the disappearance, John called in sick to work. It would mark the beginning of his suspicious behavior. At home, to relieve frustration over his missing family, he says that he dismantles the couple's bed. Then he rips out the light-colored shag carpet from the flooring, even removing chunks of the underpadding near the window. He tells authorities he did it because Sandra complained about the carpet's odor from the children having gotten sick on it and the cat having soiled it. But he also tells his attorney that he did it because he was enraged after finding the typed letter. Later that afternoon, he decides that the day of his family's disappearance is the perfect day to return a light switch to a tire store called Canadian Tire. While he was there, he figured that he purchased some anchor weights as well. At dusk, he heads out and goes for a random drive, zigzagging between cities with no apparent purpose or destination. He gets back home at midnight, and he decides to take a bike ride. While on the bike ride, he hits a brick or stone or something and falls off the bike, which conveniently supplies a cause for the multiple cuts that authorities promptly noticed on his hands. Then the next morning, Wednesday, August 18th, John is up by 5:15 a.m. He says that for something to do, he vacuums and dusts the house. He also hauled off the pieces of carpet that he had ripped out, transporting them to not one, but two separate dump yards. Later that morning, John finally decides to divulge that his family is missing to Sandra's parents and heads to their home around 11:30. At the station, police question John until his father arrives with a lawyer, discontinuing further questioning. But they had as much information as they needed. By 11:30 that night, John Rallo, fully decked out in his pale green leisure suit, was arrested and charged with murdering his daughter, the only one recovered at that point. In the meantime, the search for the rest of John's missing family continued. Authorities dragged the waterway where Stephanie's body was found looking for Sandra and Jason. They did not find them. They did, however, surprisingly find other people. They discovered the body of a Hamilton man who had disappeared on a fishing trip that April. He was found still in the driver's seat of his submerged car. Having suffered a heart attack, he apparently drove off the road to his death. They also found the body of a middle-aged woman. Several more days would pass, but on August 26th, as a helicopter was searching the waterways, they spotted a green sleeping bag floating in the Welland Canal, bound by what appeared to be rope or cord. The sleeping bag was opened on one end with a green trash bag sticking out of it. It was Sandra Rallo. As they got closer, they could see her feet were sticking out of the trash bag, her toes painted red. The ropes and sash cord that were used to tie up the bundle were elaborate, with each knot related to the next one. The knots were consistent with knots that were used in John's bondage magazines authorities discovered in John's possession the year prior. And, like her daughter, Sandra too was weighted down with the intention of being sunk to the bottom of the waterway. 2 anchors used for that purpose, 15 and 20 pounds. She had been badly beaten, and her tongue protruded between her teeth, consistent with being strangled. Sandra would be buried next to her daughter, and John Rallo would be charged with a second count of murder. The search for young Jason would continue for 2 more months and then be called off. But even without a body, law enforcement was confident that Rallo was still responsible. They charged him with the 3rd count of murder. Despite Rallo's far-fetched claims of how the day's events transpired, law enforcement theorized otherwise. They surmised that it went something more like this. John had fabricated the story about a mysterious lawyer in order to create a scapegoat that he could blame the murders on. Disparaging his wife's name in the process was an added bonus. They theorized that he and Sandra had an argument in their room, perhaps regarding one of his affairs. Or perhaps he had accused her of having one. He punches her in the face, damaging her nose and nearly dislodging her teeth. Evidence would show that a violent fight ensued in which John sustained a bite mark on his hand, and where John beat Sandra with such force that her jaw was crushed. Her blood spatters everywhere, including on the curtains, the sheets, the mattress, and soaking the shag carpet below the window. Then, with the nearby cord from the blinds within his reach, John uses it to strangle his wife. He then put 2 fingers up her nostrils and covered her mouth for 16 minutes. They surmised that his kids witnessed the atrocity. So, John kills them as well, suffocating each of them with a pillow for 4 minutes, until they're dead. John then takes the bodies to the basement. He strips them of their clothes and washes them in the washing machine along with the bloody linen. But with all the blood produced from Sandra's beating, it's a messy job. He drips blood onto the wall, door jamb, his slippers, and the floor. He places a large green trash bag over Sandra's head and another one over her feet, then stuffs her into his sleeping bag along with 2 of the anchors he bought at Canadian Tire. He then ties up the sleeping bag using knots that he'd seen in his bondage magazines. He packages Stephanie similarly, except that her small body only requires 1 trash bag and a single anchor. He folds her body into a fetal position, stuffs her in a duffel bag, then zips it shut. Although Jason was never found, authorities surmise that he gave his son the same garbage bag, sleeping bag farewell. John then rips up the carpet and starts dismantling and hauling furniture out of their bedroom. He tries to clean up, but with so much blood, he leaves behind numerous smudges, drops, and other evidence. He would try to explain away the blood, with a Sandra hemorrhaging claim along with a story about a previous nosebleed. But a blood spatter expert would refute that, demonstrating how the blood was spattered, not dropped. He heads to the basement where he hastily crafts a Dear John letter on Sandra's typewriter. Once night falls, he transfers the bodies from the garage to the trunk of his car, leaving more blood along the way. He then dumps his family's bodies in various waterways and drives away. But with John not fessing up to any of it, it would need to be proven in a court of law. In the meantime, the Canadian courts had set the suspected triple murderer's bail at $100,000. And 4 months after the murders, on Christmas Eve, John Rallo posted that bail. He would be a free man pending his trial scheduled for a year later in November of 1977. He would live with his parents during that time. He tried to return to his manager job at City Hall, but they refused. Every day he would visit his family's grave and put flowers on it. He would mow the grass at the family's home, including by his children's swing set. He would wave to the neighbors, but they would not respond or speak to him. Then finally, the trial began. It was the biggest case Hamilton had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed every day. And of course, John Rallo dressed for the occasion. Each day, reporters would dedicate at least a paragraph to describing John's attire. From his tweed suits to his 5-button vests, the dapper defendant drew attention. During the trial, a neighbor testified that they saw a light on in John's home around 5 o'clock Tuesday morning, and that they could see him moving up and down in motions consistent with ripping the carpet up. That contradicted his claim that he was asleep in the basement until 9 a.m. About a week into the trial, the woman who John had had an affair with at work also testified, exposing Rallo's infidelity to the surprise of many. Public outrage against Rallo reached a new high as a result, and the prosecution feared that John may either be in danger or skip bail. So they revoked his bail and brought him back to jail. In order to not prejudice the jury, he would arrive to court each morning before the jury arrived, so that they would not know he was in custody. John testified in his own defense for 5 hours over 2 days. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Rallo guilty on all 3 murder charges. When given an opportunity to make a statement, John stated in part, "What has kept my head above water is that I know I did not do it. But more importantly, I know Sandra knows I did not do it. Stephanie knows I did not do it. And Jason, wherever he may be, knows I did not do it." John Rallo was sentenced to 3 life sentences to run concurrently without the possibility of parole until serving 25 years. Once in prison, John spent his first Christmas behind bars in isolation because the other inmates despised him for his despicable crime and wanted him dead. Rallo appealed his conviction all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, but was turned down at each stage. 15 years into his sentence, John made a bid for early release based on a now-defunct law called the Faint Hope Clause. The clause made him eligible for early release consideration. He was turned down. In 1979, 2 years into his sentence, John turned on his old charm from behind bars and met a woman. He is reported to not have divulged the relationship to the parole board or prison officials, as the pair secretly carried on for 26 years. But despite the claim that officials were unaware of the relationship, he was somehow able to engage in private visits in a trailer located on prison grounds, with the visits totaling 72 hours during their first 10 years together. By 1986, just 10 years into his sentence, John was approved for temporary escorted absences from prison. Such absences are typically only granted for special circumstances, like attending the funeral of a close family member. But in John's case, he was allowed these absences, 17 in total, to attend holiday gatherings with his parents' wedding anniversary, and other non-essential events. For 5 years of these allowed absences, the Pollingtons were not aware that Rallo had been granted the absences, and only learned of them after people mentioned they had seen Rallo in Hamilton. Upset, Doug Pollington contacted police to alert them that Rallo had been seen in town. Their response was to warn Doug that he could be charged with harassing John. In 1990, 14 years into his sentence, John was transferred to Beaver Creek Institution, a minimum security facility in Gravenhurst, where he was still being permitted temporary escorted absences. Doug Pollington described the prison lavishly, describing how the inmates get to play golf, go out on the lake, and live the life of Riley. 16 years into John's sentence, the Pollingtons encountered John for the first time since he was imprisoned. It was at a parole hearing to determine if his escorted absences could continue. At the hearing, John claimed, "Not a day goes by when I don't think of my children and wonder what they would have accomplished by now. Birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, and Christmases are hard." His request to continue his escorted absences was approved. 7 years later, in 2000, John Rallo officially became eligible for parole and began applying. He requested to go to a halfway house where he would have the ability to come and go as he pleased during the day. He also made a bid to have unescorted absences. His requests and parole were denied, with the board noting both his lack of remorse and the fact that in his 24 years of imprisonment, he had not undergone any change that indicated he would not offend again if released. He would be denied again for each of his subsequent 3 parole hearings, requested every 2 years. However, at his 4th hearing in 2007, John tried a new strategy. He cried, and it worked. He was granted day parole, which meant unescorted passes from prison, allowing him to spend 4 nights per week living with his girlfriend of the time and 3 nights a week at a halfway house. He is allowed to go out as he pleases during the day, so long as he is back in the house overnight. He was denied full parole because he refused to admit his crimes. But despite 77-year-old John having still never acknowledged the murders or shown any remorse, in 2020 he was granted a 90-day medical pass to live with his girlfriend full-time due to COVID. Then the following year, at the first ever parole hearing that the Pollingtons could not attend due to their failing health, John Rallo was granted full parole. After over 45 years behind bars, he was set free under the conditions that he stay away from the family of his victims, as well as report any women that he meets. Despite the surviving family members' disappointment about his release, John was actually incarcerated longer than most killers in Canada. He was only kept in as long as he was because he refused to admit his guilt. John's release was both a blessing and a curse for Sandra's surviving siblings. The 40-year saga of having to deal with him and his hearings every few years would be over. But their family's murderer would be a free man, something they were dedicated to fighting against at nearly every single court and parole hearing for over 4 decades. As of the making of this video, John Rallo was 80 years old. He was last reported to still be living with his girlfriend, who he referred to as his common-law wife. The Pollingtons had always hoped that before they died, they would be able to lay Jason to rest with his mother and sister. At every parole hearing that they faithfully attended, they asked Rallo the question, "Where is Jason?" He never replied. On their journey to ensure that John Rallo never left prison, the Pollingtons began working with other victims. They would ultimately become 2 of Canada's most powerful advocates for victims' rights. Although the search for Jason's body was called off shortly after the disappearance, authorities were hopeful that his body would surface someday. In fact, they thought it had. In 1977, the year after the disappearance, the body of 5-year-old Jamie Shearer was found and misidentified as being the missing Jason. He was even buried next to Sandra and Stephanie. It wasn't until investigators from another case had the body exhumed that the error was uncovered. The Pollingtons' wish to lay their grandson to rest before they died would not come to be. In 2011, 35 years after losing their beloved family members at the hands of their son-in-law, Dove and Margaret Pollington passed away, just 1 day apart from each other. Margaret died peacefully from complications of Alzheimer's, and the following day, Doug succumbed to complications of a massive heart attack. Margaret, who was living in a long-term care facility, was not aware that her husband of 66 years had been hospitalized on Sunday, and Doug, who had slipped into a coma, did not know that his wife had passed away. So, as their son David reflected, neither one had to grieve the other's death. We hope this video did justice to Sandra, Stephanie, and Jason. Let us know what you think about this man, this crime, in the comments below. We'll end today with an excerpt from Doug Pollington's obituary.